Sega, one of the fallen superpowers of the games industry. At one point, a serious competitor to Nintendo and Atari in the home gaming console market.
Sega these days might as well be spelled B-A-N-K for bank. You've heard the old phrase, license to print money, generally meaning that someone or some product is so successful they've gotten a license to print money. Some examples are very successful people like Bill Cosby.
This documentary did not age well. From 1983 to 2001, they had a solid run developing and selling hardware. But what comes up must come down. With some questionable business decisions and a surge from the competition in the mid to late 90s, Sega's hand was forced as they bowed out of the hardware market to focus on developing and publishing software exclusively. The time between hardware iterations has practically doubled since the time of Sega's reign. Instead of waiting 8 years for the next Xbox or PlayStation, pre-turn of the millennia, you might see new hardware popping up every single year, whether it be in the form of new consoles, handhelds, or graphic boosting add-ons. Life expectancy of the hardware was a big concern back then. If I buy this now, will it be obsolete in another year? I mean, just take a look at when Apple tried to make one of these. This is a popular question from consumers even nowadays, and the answer is never immediately clear. Today I want to go over how Sega handled this. Which gaming media and accessories can I bring into another hardware generation, whether that be an upcoming one or a past one? You'll find a link in the description to a Google Sheets document that has a list of all the hardware, and there you can find what's compatible with what. I also quickly want to plug I have additional backwards compatibility charts for PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox on that sheet, those of which all have their own videos, so if you have a question, you might find your answer there. We'll be sticking in the realm of official hardware compatibility, so I'm not going to talk about any hacks or mods, being that some of these consoles are almost 40 years old. You know, and I'm sure at this point someone has a guide out there showing how to play PS3 games on a Dreamcast using only rubber bands. For the sake of simplicity, we'll be mostly sticking to Sega's primary licensed lineup. So sit back and relax as we head back to the early 80s, a time when arcade machines were at the height of their popularity and home consoles were only at their infancy.
Sega Video Game SG-1000.
Contrary to what the average American might think, the Sega Genesis nor the Sega Master System was Sega's first home console. That honor goes to the SG-1000, released July 15th, 1983 in Japan. Fatefully, the exact same day, Nintendo would release the Famicom. Sega approved a rebranded release in a few other countries like Australia and New Zealand. It never made its way officially to the States. Despite this, there was an unauthorized clone known as the Telegames Personal Arcade that was produced and made available in the US and Taiwan. Not only could this play SG-1000 games, it could play ColecoVision games. I wanted to touch on this because there are a lot more official and unofficial clones of Sega consoles, and for this video I'll primarily be sticking to the boxes manufactured by Sega themselves. It really shows how far we've come today, or I suppose how primitive it was back then. For better or for worse, you definitely don't see little Taiwanese companies making clones of the PS5. Sega released another box that played these cartridges called the SC-3000. This was Sega's first home computer / video game console. Also, I knew how batshit insane the Sega commercials were back in the 90s, but turns out they've been like that since the very start.
Sega SG-3000.
As home video game consoles were fairly new at the time, this was supposed to be the only device released. Plans for the SG-1000, which could only play games, came around after Sega learned about Nintendo's plans to make a games-only device. It kinda shows Sega's business mentality to just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. At the very least, I guess you could say that they were reactive and aware of what was going on. Moving 1 year further into the timeline to 1984, an upgraded model of the SG-1000 called the SG-1000 Mark II was released. Internally, it was identical, and as you would guess, it retained the ability to play all SG-1000 cartridges. The most noticeable upgrade was the controller. Those of you who have an eye for this sort of thing might notice they copied off of a certain somebody. The original SG-1000 did support 2 controllers, but the first controller was hardwired into the console itself. So there was a port for the second, but these controllers were obviously inspired by the Atari Joypad, except just way worse. I mean, they looked like bricks with sticks attached on them, and the triggers on the side tended to go bad very quickly. I have an idea of how to hold one of these, but I can't imagine that it would be comfortable in the slightest. The stick was also very unresponsive, so Sega's choice to rip off Nintendo and give the Mark II the soap bar controllers ended up being a solid choice, as Nintendo's invention of the D-pad and their general layout of the controller serve as a precursor to what we have today. And these new SG-1000 Mark II controllers were now both detachable. Unfortunately, if you wanted to use the Player 1 port in your original SG-1000 with these new controllers, you had to buy this special kit. It looks pretty involved and I don't think they sold a lot, but you gotta give it to Sega for, giving people the option. The controller ports on the Mark II and the Player 2 port on the original all used the same port. It was called the DE9 port, and you can remember that because if you turn it at a 90-degree angle, it's shaped like a D. It was an industry standard used in a bunch of game consoles and computers back in the day. Not only did every single Sega console use these ports, stopping at the Sega Saturn and Dreamcast, which had proprietary controller ports, but other consoles outside of Sega, even outside of Japan, used these ports like Atari, the Commodore computers, ColecoVision, the 3DO, and the list goes on. This being the case, there's actually a ton of controller compatibility between these consoles. For what it's worth, all of the Sega 8-bit consoles are forward and backward compatible as far as controllers go. Once we get into the 3-button or 6-button controllers in 16-bit with the Mega Drive or Genesis, it gets a little bit more fuzzy. I want to give a big shout out to Discombobulated Ad 883 on the Master System subreddit for testing this. Ultimately, if you bring your old SG-1000 or Master System controllers forward to the Genesis, they're going to partially map. So for example, on an SG-1000 Mark II controller, the left button will map to the A button on the Genesis, and the right button will map to the start button on the Genesis. So if you're playing like a Genesis game where you need the B and C buttons, you're kinda out of luck, but if you're playing Sonic, you're A-okay. I know we've been jumping ahead a bit, but if you want to know more about the DE9 port and how it relates to Sega Genesis controllers, I suggest you go watch Genovi's video titled Sega's Mode Button Part 1, How Do the 3 and 6 Button Gamepads Work? He goes into more detail talking about which pins correlate to which buttons. A very interesting watch, I suggest you go check him out. Although technically still 8-bit, Sega's next jump in hardware came in the form of the Sega Mark III. Hearing that Sega jingle even today is just so satisfying, just a choir of men screaming Sega. I guess Sega's advertising team would see it as a bit too serene, considering their commercials that played in the 90s.
Forgot what I was gonna say.
The Sega Mark III was initially released in Japan and later Taiwan and South Korea. Don't worry, I promise we'll be going worldwide soon. Despite still being in the 8-bit category of consoles, the Mark III offered a new video display processor and more RAM over the SG-1000 and SG-1000 Mark II. And despite having its own cartridges, it is fully backwards compatible with the SG-1000 library. Right below the cartridge slot, there's a slot for another peripheral we have not talked about called Sega My Cards. These cards were an alternative to the much more expensive to produce cartridges. The storage on these guys was only 32 kilobytes, so you weren't going to find any big Phantasy Star, Final Fantasy RPGs on here, and they were eventually considered a health risk with young children trying to eat them. Now, like a lot of stuff that Sega markets, this gets a bit confusing, so just stick with me here. There were two variants of the cards released, the Sega My Card and the Sega My Card Mark III. In Japan, they called them Sega My Cards, but everywhere else they were just Sega cards, so it's just something to keep in mind as well.
Sega My Card.
Out of the box, the Sega Mark III's card slot, you can play both variants. You are set. Now, the SG-1000 and SG-1000 Mark II can play the non-Mark III cards. They can play the earlier cards, but they require an adapter called the Card Catcher. The Card Catcher is compatible with everything we've talked about so far, as the Mark I, II, and III all have the exact same cartridge slot size. So if you want to be redundant, you can use the Card Catcher on the Mark III, despite it having its own card slot. Or I suppose in the event that the card slot breaks. There was a rewritable version of the card released in Japan called the My Card EP. Some retailers had machines installed where customers could take their EP cards, pay a fee, and have a game written to the card itself. You could overwrite what was already on the card, and the cards came pre-written with one of two games, Dragon Wing, which is hilarious, or the game Starjacker. Despite being cheap to produce, the whole card format did not meet Sega's expectations in terms of retail success.
But my grandpa put all his gaming knowledge, his whole heart, into assembling this deck. The
This card is useless.
Given that the Mark III was Sega's first true leap in hardware, I'm giving it a big thumbs up in terms of backwards compatibility. Being that the software library from the SG-1000 models is really small, it's obvious the bar was set low. Despite that, it's impressive that all of the previous controllers can be brought forward, and the fact that the Sega cards can now be played out of the box on the Mark III with no adapter required.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System.
Fresh!
And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
Yes, the Sega Master System, the first Sega console to have a widespread distribution outside of Japan. The Japanese variant would see full backwards compatibility with SG-1000 cartridges as well as Mark III cartridges. This is because the Master System is essentially just the Mark III with a new coat of paint. Unfortunately, this is not the case for Master System models released outside of Asia. These cartridges used a different form factor as they were shorter and wider and used a different pinout. So NTSC, EU, PAL, Brazilian, Australian Master System cartridges, they will not fit into a Japanese model and vice versa. It was fairly easy to tell if a Japanese cartridge was made during the Mark III production or the Master System production, as it was stated at the top of the cartridge and they matched the color of their respective console. And if you're a fan of the Sega My Cards, you'll be happy to hear that the majority of the models retained the card slot. The Master System models that didn't released with a new form factor in non-Japanese markets. These came about after the Genesis and Mega Drive were already on the market, and you can tell just by looking at the design that they took a lot of inspiration from those consoles. Not to mention the naming scheme was different depending on where you lived. You have the Master System 2 in North America and Europe, the Master System 3 in Brazil because they already had a Master System 2 which does have the card slot, and two South Korean models, the Super Game Boy 2 and the Aladdin Boy.
I can't believe it. I'm losing to a rug.
Sega would go on to engineer another accessory to utilize this card slot, in the form of Segascope 3D glasses.
3D so real, it puts the action right in your face. Not even 3D effects like these can match what you'll see through these amazing Segascope 3D glasses.
Believe it or not, these were actually made by Mark Cerny during his time at Sega, the same guy who engineered the PS4 and 5 in a cave, with a box of scraps. There was also an NES Zapper ripoff called the Light Phaser for the Master System. Unlike the 3D glasses, this was not backwards compatible with the Mark III.
時代が求めた16ビットセガメガドライブ
Moving right along, we have Sega's most successful and popular console, the Genesis, as it was known in North America, and Mega Drive everywhere else. Apologies to all the international viewers as I'll be referring to it as the Genesis, for I am a true Yank. Whatever you want to call it, it was the first Japanese Sega console to break the full backwards compatibility streak, going all the way back to the SG-1000 models. And as you may be aware, it was Sega's first proper 16-bit console. Now, despite there not being any old tech that we can throw onto the Genesis and make its gears spin, apart from the old DE9 controllers, there is a pile of adapters, accessories, and console revisions released throughout the late 80s and 90s. Let's start at the foundation and go over the primary models released. The Model 1 was chunky, sported a headphone jack, on-console volume control, and actually had two variants. The original and a later released revised model, the first of which had the text high definition graphics above the cartridge slot and a female DE9 port that was pretty sparsely used except in Japan for the Sega Mega Modem, which allowed for Japanese Mega Drives to access online features provided by Sega and third parties. The earlier released Model 1 variant is arguably the best of the bunch, as it had better audio quality than any other model and supported cartridge swapping. This was a method of swapping cartridges while the Genesis was still powered on, pressing reset, and something, hopefully favorable, would happen, like unlocking level selects, infinite lives, etc. Doing this is not recommended as it has the chance to completely fry your system. The Genesis Model 2 received a smaller, modernized shell and dropped the headphone jack and volume slider. This model and the Model 1 both featured an expansion slot for the first major peripheral that would allow Sega to take advantage of the CD media format. the Sega CD, or Mega CD as it was known outside of North America and Brazil. Not only could this guy play Sega's new Sega CD game format, but it could also play audio CDs. There were 2 models of Sega CDs produced, one for each form factor of the Genesis that we've covered so far. You had the power bottom for the Model 1 and the motorcycle sidecar for the Model 2. What's nice about this is that you can mix and match both models of Sega CD to both models of the Genesis. What makes this kind of nasty is that rather than the Sega CD drawing power from the Genesis itself, both variants of the add-on required a separate power supply. Both used the Sega Genesis Model 1 AC adapter, so if you had a Model 2, you could not mix and match the power supplies. And that's just the beginning of Sega accessories taking up your power strip real estate. The later released Sega 32X add-on, which plugged into the cartridge slot, boosted the bits from 16 to 32, would take up another outlet. And to make things more difficult, it uses the Genesis Model 2's AC adapter, so if you're using a Sega CD and 32X concurrently, you will not only be drawing the same amount of energy required to power a Tesla Model S, you will always be using 2 different AC adapters, regardless of what model of Genesis you have. And these aren't the AC adapters that have the brick halfway in the middle or the power supply is in the device itself. No, these are the big honkabaloophas that have it on the plug, and I am thankful these have been phased out of modern devices. Well, mostly.
Now on 32X, it makes me sweat. Welcome to the world of doom.
The 32X was compatible with both the Model 1 and Model 2 Genesis, and used its own proprietary cartridge format for 32-bit games. It could even talk to a Sega CD if one was plugged in, to play games that use both add-ons, creating what is now dubbed as the Tower of Power. On top of the additional AC adapter, a crossover cable was also needed to send a signal from the Genesis into the 32X, and then your original AV cable would lead the signal from the 32X into the TV set. And one last flick to the nuts, if you're using a Model 1, there's an adapter cable needed between the Genesis AV out and the patch cable. This is because the Model 1 and 2 use different AV cables, and the 32X came out pretty late and uses all Model 2 stuff. It was intended to be a semi-permanent add-on, as you could always plug in just original 16-bit Genesis games into the 32X and play them like normal. I say semi-permanent because there was another first-party accessory previously released that also used the cartridge slot. This was the power-based converter, and the key to unlocking the backwards compatibility of the Genesis, as this allowed the use of Master System cartridges and Sega Mark III cards. You heard right, the cards were back. This might seem like an odd choice from a Japanese perspective, as this format was getting really old and wasn't all that successful to begin with, but to all the regions where the Master System was their first Sega console, the cards were a little bit more fresh, and this was the Mark III version of the cards, not the SG-1000 version of the cards, so Sega wasn't holding on to them that hard. Thankfully, the power-based converter did not need its own separate AC adapter, so you can save a power outlet for your mini fridge. Unfortunately, the power-based converter does not physically fit into a Genesis Model 2. Theoretically, all of the innards are compatible, so you'd have to tear up some plastic if you want to get it to work. Europe saw the release of the Master System Converter 2, their version of the power-based converter. This guy would physically fit into the Genesis Model 2, and is backwards compatible with the Model 1, retaining all of its functionality except for the ability to play cards. Note that there were some Master System games that required a Master System controller while being played on the power-based converter. There were also a couple that were designed for an SG-1000 graphics mode. These games were not compatible with the power-based converter at all. Before we move on from the Genesis, we have a few more devices that can play Genesis cartridges to cover. There was a Japan-only version of the Mega Drive called the Sega MegaJet, which initially started as a device to be used on Japanese commercial flights. It didn't have a screen and had to be plugged into an external display. The controller was on the device itself. It had an additional controller port for a second player. It lacked the expansion port, so a Sega CD could not be used. It's not listed as compatible with the 32X or power-based converter, nor could I find anyone willing to test. But being that it has all the hardware to support one, the only thing that would block it is the plastic mold of the device. Being that there's nothing official saying that this is true, I'm still going to mark it as no, but if anyone has any information, please leave it in the comments and I'll update my sheet. The MegaJet would actually be the basis of another device released later called the Sega Nomad. This was a true portable Genesis, sporting its own screen and battery pack, taking 6 AA's, an option MegaJet users did not have. In terms of compatibility, it's the exact same as the MegaJet. It has been confirmed that the 32X won't physically fit all the way in there, but with a bit of modification you can make it happen. Despite having its own screen, you could still plug the Nomad into its own external display. And like the Megajet, it accepted a Genesis 2 AC adapter. All in all, it was the real deal, a portable Genesis. Although at the rate this thing eats batteries, you'll probably be stuck to a wall outlet most of the time. Another first-party Genesis was made in the form of the Sega CDX as it was known in North America, or the Sega Multi-Mega CDX as it was known in Brazil. This was a Genesis with a built-in Sega CD. It retains all of the functions of that console and its add-on, with the additional ability to play audio CDs on the go. You see, it could be powered by two AA batteries to use the CD player function, but you could not play Genesis games like this. I mean, this thing lacks a screen, so you're going to be grounded to a television set anyway. It's also compatible with the 32X and power base converter.
Now take a look at this backwards compatibility.
Like I said at the start of the video, there are several licensed and unlicensed imitators for these consoles, and the Genesis is no different. In fact, in the realm of Sega consoles, it probably has the largest amount of offenders. Released very late in the lifespan, the Model 3 falls under the category of being manufactured by a third party, in this case, Majesco, and licensed by Sega under the name Genesis 3, only ever released in North America. Its compatibility with accessories is less of that compared to the Model 1 and 2, as it lacked the CD expansion port and a chip required for the 32X to function. It was also incompatible with the Virtua Racer Genesis game. No dice on the power base converter either. It did have one major benefit over its older brothers. Its cartridge slot shape can accommodate Mega Drive cartridges from Japan, which had a wider form factor. Before we leave the Genesis, I want to give a shout out to the JVC officially licensed Genesis clones. These include the Wonder Mega, its revised model, the Wonder Mega M2, and the JVC XI. These were premium made, premium priced Genesis clones that came with a Sega CD built in. The CD read time for these were faster than your usual Sega CD, and they were compatible with the 32X. Unfortunately, none of them support the originally released power base converter. Another one of those situations where technically the innards would support it, but you'd have to Frankenstein your console to make it work. But if you're in Europe and have the Master System converter too, that'll work just fine. Much like the Genesis 3, these also had a wider cartridge slot so you could play any region of Genesis game as long as the game itself didn't have any region lockout capabilities.
Yeah, I feel good!
Alright, we are finally done talking about the Genesis. Let's go back to Sega's first true handheld console in 1990, the Sega Game Gear. The Game Gear was not a revision of a previous Sega console gone handheld, nor was it some kind of portable CD player. It was Sega just straight up copying the Game Boy, its main selling point being its backlit color LCD screen.
Whoa. Color.
And it had the Game Boy Advance PSP sideways format long before those two would even come to the table. Much like the Game Boy, it had its own cartridge, adopting the Genesis jet black look in contrast to the Game Boy's gray. Like a lot of Nintendo's handhelds, the Game Gear was completely region-free. The only caveat being that depending on which region of Game Gear you have, some cartridges have the ability to read that and will boot into that region's language. Now, unlike the Genesis, which had a pile of adapters and converters to play different game formats, the Game Gear really only has one primary licensed one, the Master Gear Converter. Simply put, it allowed Master System games to be played on the Game Gear. It was only ever released for non-Asian markets, so if you remember from about 10 minutes ago, the Western-style Master System cartridges were wider, while the Asian ones were thinner and taller. The Master Gear Converter will only accept the Western ones. Unfortunately, it lacks a card slot to run Sega cards. Although, with a Master System region converter, you could convert the wider Master System cartridge format to the Japanese smaller, thinner one, and that would allow you to use a card catcher, thereby allowing the use of Sega cards. This is like the theme of the video, but I just love how if you have enough plastic stuff to plug in, you can just go back in time with these Sega consoles. Additionally, if you wanted to play a two-player Master System game on your Game Gear with a converter, there was an accessory for that, the Master Link cable. This allowed a second player to use a DE9 controller. Surprisingly, there was no official way to play Game Gear games on your Genesis. I'd say surprisingly because Nintendo did that with the Super Game Boy and the Super Nintendo. I don't know, maybe a bit too tame for Sega. We're busy building the Stairway to Heaven over here. Okay, so next up is the Saturn, right? You would be wrong. Enter the Sega Pico and Advanced Pico Beena / Beena Lite. These were educational consoles that had proprietary cartridges made for them. The first Pico came out right before the Saturn in '93. It saw a worldwide release and it came with these cartridges called Storyware, which were in fact region-free. We also have the Advanced Pico Beena and Beena Lite, which unfortunately were not backwards compatible with anything from the original Pico. Wildly enough, there were Pokemon games released on the Beena. This was around the time where you started seeing Sega games on Nintendo consoles, so it's kinda crazy that the same thing was happening vice versa. Well, at least in Japan on this children's toy. These were released in 2006 and 2008 respectively, exclusively in Japan, making them Sega's last released game consoles. I thought I'd get them out of the way now. I'm really just trying to give Sega some respect and end on the Dreamcast, as it was meant to be. But before we get to the Dreamcast, we have to talk about the Sega Saturn.
And remember, look for Sega Saturn. It's out there.
There's really not too much to say in terms of backwards compatibility, as it was a CD-based console, yet Sega CDs were not supported. It could play audio CDs and karaoke CDs, but lacked the ability to play Saturn games from other regions. Unfortunately, the same goes for the Dreamcast.
Yo, Sonic! Sonic! Man, stay off the light speed!
My bad.
Saturn games nor any other previous Sega games will work on a Dreamcast, and yet again it had its own proprietary controllers. The Dreamcast did retain its ability to play audio CDs, but lost its karaoke CD compatibility. One fun fact I can leave you with is that in the late 90s, when Microsoft was conceptualizing the original Xbox, they were in talks with Sega, and the idea that the Xbox would be backwards compatible with Dreamcast games was thrown around. Obviously this never played out, but looking at how Microsoft has handled backwards compatibility of their consoles throughout the years, I like to imagine a future where my original Sonic Adventure disc would play on a Series X. Actually, probably a good call by Microsoft with all the rampant piracy going on with Dreamcast games back in the day. Maybe that was Sega's Hail Mary, like, Microsoft, please make a console where people have to buy our games and can't just download them off the internet and burn them to a CD.
Barely made it.
Alright folks, well Sega is out of consoles and out of money, so that marks the end of the video. It truly is wild how different their business mentality was from Nintendo's in the 90s. Not to say Nintendo didn't have some major flops during that time period, but they seemed to be a lot more clean cut, more willing to move on than cling to what was old and established. Like it was a huge deal with consumers that the Super Nintendo did not play original NES games. But regardless of that, I think Sega took another approach, and that was just building this big ecosystem of products. Some definitely got more out of hand than others, but if anything, it's a marvel to look back at, especially for a Sega fan such as myself. Alright, well that's about everything I wanted to ramble about. It's about midnight at the time of recording, so I gotta cut this off. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit all those buttons if you don't mind. They really help the algorithm recommend this video to others. If I got something wrong, which I probably did, please leave a comment telling me what a big, stupid idiot I am. Please don't forget to tip your waitresses, watch out for each other, and stay safe out there.